Well, Aaron, thank you very much indeed for contributing to our Jerome Moross Centenary Project. It's always of enormous value to have a member of the family of a special artist taking part. And of course we have contributions from Susanna, but it would be particularly interesting also to hear from you. I know you were young when he died, but that's also a very interesting perspective and a unique perspective for a young person at the time to be in the presence of a very special artist. I wonder if you can recall any of your memories of Jerome Moross from what would have been his last days and your very early days.
He passed when I was 11, and so in the last year or so, he obviously wasn't well, his health, and my grandmother passed in, I guess, 6 months earlier, 5 months earlier. So it was a very difficult time in the family. So it's hard for me to really remember deep conversations because I was also little, 8, 9, 10. But I do remember observing him, and he was this voracious reader. He always had a stack of books by his bed, and it just seemed to be, 4 or 5, and he had tons of books. There were in where he would write, compose. There was a whole wall of books, and it was my understanding he basically read everything. It wasn't just a library for show. It was a library that he'd actually read, and it's an impressive collection. And I remember him in the morning. He'd read the New York Times. I can visualize it because he'd sit on the same side of it with his back to the sink. It was a small New York kitchen. The apartment was big, but the kitchen wasn't. And he would read the paper in a way, the New York Times, he would quarter it, if you will. If you were looking at a quarter section of the page, like if the paper's folded in half, he would fold that in half, and he would read the whole thing that way. And he would just flip through it, and when he was done with his coffee and breakfast and the New York Times, then he'd go to work. And the guy just read a lot.
Yes, it's clear, isn't it, that he had an extraordinarily inquisitive and very serious mind, I'd say, really, all through his life. And obviously you're remembering some of this, and from first-hand experience were seeing a man who was very kind and gentle and relaxed on the surface, but inside very deep, I'd say, wouldn't you?
Yeah, he was intense. He had, my understanding is he read Euclid to learn geometry. So I think at one point in college I tried reading Euclid. I didn't get too far. But it's very, dry material, but he's that kind of guy. He would just wanted to learn geometry, so he read Euclid. They played a lot of puzzles. My grandparents were very in cards, and it was sort of a funny thing with the cards. They played every day. They played this game called Spite and Malice, and they would play some other games, but that was the main game, 3 decks. And I would sit and I would watch them, and they would play, I don't know, once or twice a day. It was a big game in the family. And I actually learned to play. By the time I was 6 or 7, I had figured out the rules. But I would sit and watch them play. Different people you can play up to 2 to 4 people, 2 to 4 players. And I would just learn by osmosis watching them. But he and my grandmother, there was this funny thing. They would play a penny a card, and so whoever won, whatever was left, you had to pay pennies. And my grandfather had this big, not a bucket, but like a container, and just overflowing with pennies. And my grandmother had a little smaller one, and she was always like putting pennies into it to pay him. But one day there's a quarter, and I said, "Grandma, what's this quarter for?" She said, "Oh, I said, "Why don't you use the quarter to pay him?" And she said, "Oh, that's my lucky quarter." So he cleaned her out in cards, but they played a lot of cards, and every afternoon there was this word puzzle they'd play, and so sort of always intellectually challenged and just looking for something. And that's a lot of my memory. We would just play, and I still actually have a 3-deck pack of cards. I think it was his. I still have all that, but yeah, lots of cards and puzzles and reading. Yeah, he was just very, very curious. Clearly a curious mind.
This quality you're talking about, I think, comes across in a kind of way in his music, because he was an undemonstrative person, wasn't he? And his music is wonderfully expressive, very powerful often, and undemonstrative. It's not music that shows off. I'm maybe not expressing myself terribly well, but what I mean is that it has a kind of combination of deep involvement with its subject, but also a certain detachment. It's not a composer writing about himself, that's what I mean. It's a bit like Verdi, who I always said didn't write about himself, but deeply involved himself in a Shakespearean way with what he saw around him. And I think that Jerome Moross, his music is like this, and it seems to come out of what you're saying of him as a person, that he was deeply involved with what was around him. And so this wonderfully warm and kind and approachable person, and yet a deep man who was, as it were, really with his mind and his feelings rather profoundly focusing a lot of the time on the world around him.
Yeah, he was. There was when you were asking me about some early memories, I remember him. There was a element that you had to give him a certain amount of space, and he was always thinking. The irony was, as a composer, there was no music in the house, and I think that's because it was all in his head. And so you could talk and you could do different things, but often there was almost no music in the house, and because he was just always composing, I think, and it was a distraction. But yeah, clearly he was always thinking. And I would hang out over there. It was a fairly, I know the address, 610 West End, apartment 9C. It overlooked the entryway of the building, and I remember used to look out, and but the baby grand was by the window overlooking 90th, and behind it were his bookcases with the thin shelves for his writing, and obviously all the books, and there was 2 chairs with a coffee table and the couch, and next to it was his card table, and I can actually visualize the card table. He had the card table, he's to the right, sitting to his right, and behind him would be the window, and he had cigarettes, and I think there was always a lit cigarette, and he had his paper, and he used to use these erasers. They were really great erasers, but they bounced, and they were bright and colorful. They were from some New York music store, and he would write there with his he had a little, 8x8 cardboard, very thin cardboard that he would put his palm on so he wouldn't smudge, even though everything would often get smudged with the pencil, but that would help. And that was his setup, and I would sit and I would watch him, and it must have been, I guess, the summer of 76 or 77, and we were having dinner. My mother and I were in the apartment, and all of us were having dinner. My brother must have been away at camp, and the story I remember is he said, "Oh, Aaron, do you want to learn to play piano?" And I guess because I'd been watching him and hanging around the piano so much and poking around, and I jumped up out of the table and I ran as fast as I could from the dining room all the way to the piano. And I got there and I looked back and there was nobody there. And so I sort of slinked back to the dining. I said, he said, "Well, maybe tomorrow. We'll start tomorrow." So I was 5 and he was, 60 something. So it was a little different, but yeah. So he taught me, and he was my first piano. And the next day we started playing, one-handed, and went from there. But yeah, so he was my first piano teacher, and it was exciting. It was exciting for his approval at piano.
He was obviously a wonderfully warm family man, a person who very, very greatly valued and appreciated his family and had a great affection for you.
Yeah, he and my grandmother were always good to me. I loved going up there, and he was always kind to me. Obviously, he worked a lot, and his profession was composing, and so we'd be there, and during the day he'd be working most of the day. It wasn't, I think even though it was in the apartment, mentally he went to work. That was his work. I don't think he composed at night. I think it was a day thing, and he sort of was able to turn that on and turn it off. But he and my grandmother were always, I have memories going with it to the park, or my grandmother taking me for, an ice cream sundae or something, and my grandfather giving me a book or helping me play solitaire, or being happy that I was sitting there watching them play cards. And being 4, 5, 6, just watching them play. I mean, they played a lot of cards. It was amazing how much cards they played.
And Aaron, what about now? Do you have contact with your grandfather's music still?
We do some, not regularly. His flute concerto is one of my favorites. And actually, at our wedding, when my wife and I are married 9 years, and at the end of the ceremony, we played, when we walked off, we played the title track to The Big Country. So that was that people got a kick out of that as we wandered off. And my son is named after him, Noah Jerome. And we tried to talk to him about it, play some music, and he's seen some of The Big Country, and I don't think he's quite made the connection, though. He studies piano. He's only 7, but I don't think he's quite connected who his grandfather was. That'll come.
Well, he will certainly have access to a great deal of information about his great-grandfather, I think I'm right, through this project, because we have so many contributors who are explaining very, very clearly the great qualities and extraordinarily, specially expressive qualities and unique qualities of Jerome Moross. Aaron Tarjan, Jerome Moross's grandson, thank you very, very much indeed for contributing to this centenary project about your grandfather, a great and very remarkable man. Many, many thanks.